one of the biggest things about non-commodity content just goes back to your brand. You need to focus on like what are things that only your business can do and share that with the world. And that's going to be what helps you attract the customers that need your specific solution.
Debbie Chu is an SEO and digital PR consultant with 11 years of experience in digital marketing. She specializes in content marketing and cross-team collaboration within organizations of all sizes. She's also spoken at industry conferences like MozCon, WTS Fest, and SearchLove. Welcome to the show, Debbie.
Thank you. Thank you. Excited to be here, and thank you for having me. Really excited to join the party.
All right, so let's see what you have for us. Debbie, what did you bring to the party?
So I brought in my tool, the commodity versus non-commodity content types tool.
Awesome. Really excited for that. But Debbie, as you know, we start this show with a little game of two truths and a lie before we get into all the nitty-gritty on the marketing side. So what do you have for me?
Okay, so the three that I'm going to share with you are, I don't know how to drive, I don't know how to bike, and I don't know how to skateboard.
I'm going to say you don't know how to bike.
I do know how to bike. I don't know how to drive.
How are you getting around Nebraska?
Yes, I have family and friends that know how to drive.
That was a good one. That was a good one. Yeah, driving sucks. Honestly, if you can get away with never learning it, I don't blame you at all. All right, so Debbie, before we dive into everything, can you tell us what non-commodity content is?
Yeah, so I mean, I think my definition of what non-commodity content is basically content that is created by humans for humans. It shouldn't be something that an LLM would be able to create, but something that, you know, brands really focus and share like what is their unique sort of point of view on a specific topic. Any content that's easy for LLMs to create, like that's going to be considered commodity. And then anything that's going to be a little bit difficult or requires that unique experience or perspective, that's going to be considered non-commodity.
Because the LLMs are literally out there taking information from other sources. I mean,
yes,
I think that's a good way of framing it.
Yeah, no, I think that matches like what I'm thinking as well. Like when I looked at the slide of, there's like examples of what were non-commodity content, like there was like titles. And when I read them, it sounded like YouTube videos. So it's like very like a super niche specific thing that, you know, someone doesn't typically search. Number one, we're not necessarily trained to search that way. And that's why we haven't been searching that way. And that's why Google hasn't been like rewarding that type of content. But now, because, you know, LLMs can do the sort of commodity content, there it feels like there's less need of that. You really just need to be very specific and nuanced in your copy and the take that you share in your content.
Well, when Google released their guidance for AI optimization, one of the key things mentioned in it is avoiding commodity content.
Yeah, I think the concept of non-commodity content, it's something that Google has actually shared prior to this year. And I think the reason is because folks are using LLMs for getting information on the web. And in order for them to get that information, they're going to rely on, you know, what is exactly going to be helpful to humans today. If right now I can ask questions, like a simple question like, what is Semrush? You know, it's going to pull from like what it knows. Whereas the opportunity with non-commodity content is like, what's special about Semrush and like what interesting point of view can Semrush provide? That's kind of different from what exists today. And that's the type of content that Google is trying to advocate for and that businesses should really focus our attention on.
And you're going to show us a way to make the decision easier about the type of content we should be creating?
Yes. So I kind of thought about like, how can I make this concept a little bit easier for folks to understand? I think that, you know, the phrase non-commodity content can be a bit confusing for folks. And I try to think about like, okay, when I looked at the slides that they shared, they anchored the idea on kind of like three main areas. So there's kind of like three properties of what makes non-commodity content. One is like it's specific, and then two is authentic, and then number three is it's unique. So like how can I play with these factors and then also like map it to existing content types that we are all familiar with, and then figure out like, okay, what are the insights that we can find from like bucketing each content format. And so that's kind of what I'm going to be sharing with the tool that I built. This is the tool. I got a little bit inspired by kind of like retro video games, DDR. So I kind of did like carousel here, but essentially you have like a bunch of different content formats. I have 10 in total. And then for each one, I've scored them by a few levers. So the first three are the ones that are kind of like mapping directly to what Google shared as they shared specific as one area. So that's the focus, like how focused is this piece of content? And then secondarily is authenticity. So am I sharing some sort of firsthand knowledge or experience in this piece of content? Number three is they shared was unique. And I changed that up to originality. How original is this piece of content? Are you sharing a unique point of view? Are you using original data? And then the last one was something that I've added. And I think it's really important the way that the industry has been thinking about content has been quite focused on like, okay, what's going to perform well for SEO? What's going to do well in search engines? But I think we really need to pivot that and really think about who is the end user of the search engines and now like who is the end user of the LMs. So we're not just optimizing for LMs or search engines, we're actually optimizing for people and humans. And so that's why I wanted to make sure that that was also something that was reflected in this tool of like, you know, how do you make sure that you write content that's not just for anyone under the sun, but like one person or like a group of people who is very specific that you're trying to target. So like think of like your ICP, for example, like who is that ideal customer persona for your business or your brand that you really want to focus on. And like if you can write content very specific to them, that's also going to help move the needle of like something that is typically high commodity and that change that into more of a non-commodity type of content. So I've kind of have like a randomizer here. So you can kind of randomly pick a content type and then it'll show you the scores and then kind of like what is the verdict. So for this example, comparison content is considered like borderline commodity. And happy to kind of like talk a bit more about like the scores of like each one and how I came about it.
I think, I would love to break down some of these individual things more and open up this conversation around how marketers can avoid creating commodity content. But how did you just pull on your own personal experience and content when deciding these different measurements and just the likelihood that format will just fall into it? Because obviously there's going to be exceptions for everything, right? Like there could be like a super unique listicle, I guess. But you're not wrong in that the listicle format is very common, right? So is that what you're thinking of like, okay, probability wise, if you default to this content type, unless you really push the envelope and deliberately try to be extremely different, authentic, etc., you might fall into the pitfalls of that content type?
Yeah, right. I think you pretty much like hit the nail on the head of like what I was trying to do here. So one thing that you'll notice is that I can actually change these levers. And as I move them, you can change them and it'll become less of a commodity less of a commodity and more of a non-commodity content type. So kind of like stepping back a little bit, I first narrowed down like 10 content types that I think are pretty common in terms of like, you know, what do people create for the websites? And then from there, I wanted to do a very like, how can I do this in an unbiased way? Like, how can I score each of these in an unbiased way? So I worked with Claude. I created a prompt, and essentially the prompt describes like what are the different levers and then what are the different content types. And then I gave it to an LLM to score each content type. And then I did it twice in like an incognito mode so that it's not giving me a biased answer. And then from there, I kind of aggregated all of the scores, and I also did my own score and then combined that to do this like final scoring of each of the content types. So what you see here is kind of like based on a typical comparison page, a typical how-to page, what would it typically score? And then the idea is that you can create these types of content. Not saying you should not create listicles and comparison, etc. But the more that you can lean into these levers, the less commodity it feels.
Yeah, no, I love that. So I can see people using this in their ideation to help them. I'm thinking about this even just for video, right? Like when we come up with our video ideas, we sit there at the beginning and we're modulating, like, what's that exact angle? What's that distinct take? And I like this as a mechanism for helping people like frame that brainstorm that happens early on of like, okay, if I'm writing, or like they get an outline or they get a first draft, and I can imagine editors kind of sliding these scales and trying to figure out maybe where the weaknesses are, or where they might need to go back to the writer and say, hey, this is really great, but maybe you need to speak more in your first person voice because you have experience in this, or if you don't, maybe you need to talk to somebody who does, to get some of that in there. So I really like the utility of it. I know we probably don't have time to go through all 10, but which ones do you think are the most important to flag here in terms of either they were surprising to you or that you think they're, like, again, things like listicles are used so often. Like, which ones do you think it makes sense to walk through?
I think the ones that I expected to have a low score, or like they're very like high commodity content, would be like a listicle, glossaries. So like nowadays, like if I use LLMs, if I have a question about a topic, I'm likely just going to ask it, and then it's going to give me, based off of its knowledge base, what that answer is. And so I think doing glossary pages on like generic topics is not going to be very helpful going forward. And then listicle is like a similar thing where typically when you're writing a listicle, you are just pulling from different websites. So you already have an idea of like, okay, I'm going to do a listicle of the best SEO tools. So I know, generally what are the top 10 tools. I'm just going to look at their product pages and pull some information from those pages into my listicle. And like that is content that an LLM can easily replicate. And so it feels like there's no need to do that type of content, and if you do, you have to really think about like the different angles to make it more unique and not commodity. And then I think one thing that was kind of interesting to me was comparison content. I feel like through my work, when I've previously thought about like what is considered like bottom of funnel content, I'm going to think of like comparison pages, right? People are pretty ready to buy when they are searching X versus Y.
Yeah.
And I think with LLMs today, like you can ask it a very personalized comparison question. So like, I am a person based in Nevada and I'm looking to grow my grass outside, and I need to find the right fertilizer for Henderson because it's really hot outside. And so you can get like super, super specific, and then it can kind of help provide you with like the options and help you do that comparison. And so I feel like a generic comparison page is just going to be less useful if, again, LLMs can just do something that's like very personalized to the user. And so those are kind of the things that kind of jumped out to me of like, these things are going to, unless you change how you approach them, they're going to be less relevant going forward.
Yeah, because you're right. So many people, when they ask, especially with the ones using LLMs for search, the LLM is doing this legwork instead of somebody just finding that list or that comparison blog post. And I know that some people are still talking about listicles as being effective because LLMs are pulling them in as sources. And yet still, that's a different strategy, right? Like, I think what you're talking about is like, oh, sure, you can get cited. Right. But that doesn't necessarily change the answer that the LLMs are giving if your list is exactly the same as 10 other lists. So like the biggest benefit you can get is maybe the errant click that somebody makes from the citations. But in terms of like actual value being offered, you would need to do something pretty distinct, which is why I think the baseline for a listicle these days is like first person testing and, like just all this criteria, because that's the kind of stuff that could be mentioned outside of just like the citation, like, oh, so and so who's an expert at this, tested all these different things. But I think it's interesting because some of this stuff is cited in LLMs all the time. But you're right that it's like LLMs make the answer. The people aren't reading these pages anymore.
Right, exactly. I think with listicles, yeah, it's great for your metrics, maybe like, oh, look, our AI visibility is so high because like they keep citing our listicle. But at the end of the day, is the user actually converting? Like, are they actually going to be your customer? Or is LLMs just pulling some information from your listicle, not even having your brand show up as like a selection criteria? And so at the end of the day, you're not even considered. And so you're kind of just giving free visibility to your competitors in that case, right? And so on the non-commodity content side of things, we have that firsthand experience really showing up in opinion and thought leadership content. And then secondarily is like original data. This is one of my favorite sort of content types, but essentially like if there is any proprietary data that your product has, or can you do a survey that's going to be impactful and like interesting to your target audience. That is data points that LLMs cannot necessarily provide to users. They can make it up. They can make up statistics, but like, and it can help you do the analysis of your research. But like the data that you gather, that first step is something that you need to come with and then bring it to the LLM and be able to create this unique original content. And then the other one I wanted to share was like product review. So again, similar to what we've mentioned already of like, I have actually tried these different solutions and, I understand what are the pain points and I'm going to recommend, like headphones, for example. Like I've tested 1,000 headphones and like, this is the one if you have like a small budget and you want to use it for work and you want to make sure the mic is good. Like these are things that LLMs can't experience for you. Like it can't help you test that headphone to see if it matches what you want as a user. And that's where like this type of content, humans need to create this type of content so that when LLMs are unsure about something, or there are things that it cannot experience, it needs humans to kind of tell it, this is what the experience was like. Like this is where the need for non-commodity content comes into play.
And it just goes back to why Reddit is so popular / being pulled into answers generated across everything, right? Because it is
right.
That first-person experience that people are craving and trying to find the most authentic version of that. Like, okay, I can read, 15 articles about these Bose headphones, but I want to hear from a real human being who put them on and use them and why they're, like, are they using it just for music? Are they using it for podcasting? Like, what are they using it for? So I totally hear what you're saying. And I think it does seem like that first person experience is just going to be huge in the AI, or I mean, it is huge in the AI era. So how, I mentioned my idea upon first seeing this of like, oh, I can see this being used as like ideation, but also like tweaking an early idea. How else do you use, if not the tool, these concepts, and how do you recommend anyone listening, think about this stuff?
Yeah. Very good question that I also need to think more about of like the use cases of it. And I really love the idea that you had shared of like, when I create YouTube videos or can I share this with content writers to kind of help them better think about how to adjust the different levers as they write their content. I think for me, one of the takeaways is just like a mindset shift. A lot of the content types that are high commodity risk, they are kind of like typically what we think of when we do SEO content. And I think we really need to sort of pivot and think more about like, our strategy can't only just be like these three. We need to also work with other teams to work on like these other types of content that's also going to be very impactful. So for example, like original data, like that's something that, again, I think is extremely valuable if you are able to provide that type of data and then create like different stories around it and then work with your PR team, for example, to pitch it to journalists and be able to get your brand mentioned on like publications and like talk about, okay, this, but business did a study on XYZ, and that kind of helps position your brand as a thought leader in this specific area. So that's going to just give you a lot more to work with compared to just another listicle on the website or on the web. And so I think what's important here is that in the past few years, we've focused a lot on these types of content, and it's clearly going to, like, we really need to kind of pivot and shift our strategy and be able to like work with other teams outside of SEO to be able to create the content that really shares our brand's like unique point of view, our brand's like proprietary data. And I think, like, to your point about like working outside of just the website, like mentioned YouTube and then Reddit, like those are areas that your brand needs to kind of think about, like, how do I increase my presence there? Or how can I share my brand's unique point of view in those areas? Because that's also where LLMs are pulling information from to understand your brand and, what your brand is about.
I love something you said, which was basically we can use this for buy-in internally. Because if you're talking about this mental shift, this is helping to tell that story of like I said, I've seen the word commodity just thrown around without like there being a ton of discussion around it. And I think it's interesting to be like, okay, if Google keeps using this word and we're trying to create stuff that is moving in the direction that Google wants to reward, this helps to move people away, like you said so well, of the kind of defaults, the things that we kind of have been crutches or that we've relied on for a long time, and start to tell the story of why content needs more investment than it ever has. I mean, even if you think about opinion, that's getting people who are really involved in your product or service, like that industry, right? They have to know what they're talking about in order for their opinion to really make an impact when they share it. And the same with data studies. I mean, I'm totally with you. That has been successful for years, and yet it's a lot of work. It's a lot of money.
Yes.
There's a lot involved. But you're right. Like, this is a good way to start to tell the story of breaking down the silos within an organization and being like, listen, we have, it would be interesting to do like a full audit of how many articles, a company has that falls within these different levels of commodity, because, something like that could be very eye-opening to think like, oh, okay, maybe some of this used to work, but it doesn't anymore. And what does it look like to create something that is non-commodity content? So I think this is really cool. What inspired you to build this in the first place?
Good question. I think part of it is like a little bit of like newsjacking, I guess, of like, okay, everyone's talking about non-commodity content. So like, how can I bring in like a little bit of a different spin on it? Because everyone's going to be talking about it in terms of like, again, like going back to this, like if I'm talking about non-commodity content, I might create like a how-to, and like everyone, or like how to write commodity content, for example. And like everyone can write that article. Like, it's not going to be necessarily unique in terms of like the content that you share on that page. So I was just trying to think of like, how can I make it something that is maybe like interactive? So okay, it's still approaching non-commodity, but I think being able to play around with the information and kind of get your brain to think a little bit differently about all these different types of content, that's kind of where I wanted to just challenge myself as well, of like, how can I make this concept a bit easier for people to understand, but also how can I create something that helps people see like they really need to change how they think about different types of content. And I think, again, like at the end of the day, I'm not saying you shouldn't do, certain types of content, but you just need to do it in a way that moves the levers forward. And, ultimately that's going to be what's needed in like the next 2 years of like what content is going to do well in the next 2 years. That's the type of content that's going to do well.
Why non-commodity content matters.
So I think one of the biggest things about non-commodity content just goes back to your brand. If your brand doesn't have a like point of view on topics within your industry, then I think that's an area that, potentially you have to work with your product team to like figure out like, okay, what's different about our product and how we view the world. And then take that information and turn that becomes sort of your brand story and what you should anchor your SEO and other marketing activities around. Like it should not be focused on like what are things that LLMs can do? What are things that, other businesses can do? You need to focus on like what are things that only your business can do and share that with the world. And that's going to be what kind of helps you attract the customers that need your specific solution.
Love that. I think that's great. Debbie, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing this with us. If people want to follow you and your work, where can they find you?
Yeah, you can follow me on LinkedIn. You can also visit my website to get to this tool, debbieychu.com. But yeah, happy to connect and thank you for having me.
Yeah, we'll definitely include the link in the show notes. So if you're watching this, check it out. Play around with it. See if there's any other use cases that you have or ways that it's helped you that we can, because I think everybody's going to find a novel way to use stuff like this. And I love when people share those unique uses, right? It can help the rest of us. Thank you so much, Debbie.